Hi there, I'm Tracy Smith, and this is Here Comes the Sun, a closer look at some of the people, places, and things we bring you every weekend on Sunday morning. We start with a sprawling, interconnected world where a single event decades ago can have lasting effects today. We're not talking geopolitics, though. Luke Burbank takes us inside the Marvel Universe.
The Marvel Universe is the biggest story that has ever been told. It all happens in the same setting. Stories that happened in 1961 or 1962 have consequences in comics that are coming out this week.
Douglas Wolk is a writer and Marvel expert who patiently explained to me, a non-comic book person, that Marvel might be the longest-running and most voluminous story told in human history. And it's all connected, meaning if the Hulk stubbed his toe back in 1979, Captain America could be dealing with the consequences here in 2022.
All of those events are its history, its past, what it can draw on for this perpetually evolving story. Not just a continuous story going on for 6 decades, but a continuous story going on in many, many threads at once that can cross each other at any time.
More from Luke's chat with the man who read all the Marvels, coming up a little later in the show.
If you look at 60 years of Iron Man stories, you are looking at 60 years of how America feels about the relationship between the army, the military, and manufacturing, heavy industry, because that is who Tony Stark, Iron Man, is. He is somebody who owns a manufacturing company that makes weaponry, that makes armature. And in the early 60s, it's great. It's rah-rah, let's fight the commies, we're doing our thing. A few years later, Vietnam is going on, and suddenly we're not really sure how we feel about this.
Then, on to another kind of odyssey. Martha Teichner spent more than 2 years following a man on a quite puzzling mission.
So timer on.
You saw it.
How many seconds?
47 seconds.
Wow.
With his feet.
Okay, that goes there.
AJ being AJ, he had to try this Rubik's variation, the Star Minx.
That is messed up.
He never solved it.
Yep, and now it's broken.
Why are you so fascinated with puzzles?
Puzzles to me are all about curiosity. And curiosity to me is the most important human value we have. Without curiosity, we'd be nowhere.
A.J. Jacobs likes slotting himself into his subject matter. For one of his books, he read the entire Encyclopedia Britannica. For another, he followed the Bible to the letter.
Here I am in the great Vermont corn maze, 100% lost.
So, of course, he had to attempt, possibly, the hardest corn maze in the country.
That's all coming up right here on Here Comes the Sun. You have to marvel at how far the Marvel Universe has come, from just a few comic books back in the 60s to the Hollywood blockbusters of today. Our Luke Burbank caught up with what you might call a super fan.
Since the dawn of time, or technically the 1960s to be precise, a tale has been building. A single, connected narrative involving thousands of characters and millions of pages of comics.
The Marvel Universe is the biggest story that has ever been told. It all happens in the same setting. Stories that happened in 1961 or 1962 have consequences in comics that are coming out this week.
Douglas Wolk is a writer and Marvel expert who patiently explained to me, a non-comic book person, that Marvel might be the longest-running and most voluminous story told in human history. And it's all connected, meaning if the Hulk stubbed his toe back in 1979, Captain America could be dealing with the consequences here in 2022.
All of those events are its history, its past, what it can draw on for this perpetually evolving story. not just a continuous story going on for 6 decades, but a continuous story going on in many, many threads at once that can cross each other at any time.
Marvel started publishing comics in the 1930s, but according to Wolk, it was only in the early 1960s that Stan Lee, Mike Ditko, and Jack Kirby pioneered the idea of having all the characters live in the same universe. Wolk had been a fan of Marvel Comics since he was a boy, but his son Sterling didn't start off sharing his love of, as he calls it, spandex violence. But then,
eventually he was like, oh, but superhero comics are a complicated system. I like complicated systems. Hey, Dad, I'd like to read all the Marvel Universe comics. Not in the order they were published, the order the events happened to the characters. It's like, okay, that's a pretty tall order.
So they set out on a father and son adventure, tackling a seemingly impossible challenge.
You just have to find a way in and wander around inside it. There's lots of weird and boring and arcane and confusing parts, and there are beautiful and magical and fascinating parts.
They found themselves jumping around from comic to comic, devouring page after page, issue after issue.
And I started thinking, what would it actually look like to read these 500,000 pages of comics, to read the 27,000 superhero comics that Marvel had published since 1961?
It was at this point that Douglas Wolk started to transform from mild-mannered Portland writer to Dr. Marvel Brain, aka one of the few people on planet Earth to read all of the Marvels, which is also the title of the book he wrote about the experience.
Superhero comics are stories about our world made much bigger than life and turned into this enormous, endless, ongoing soap opera.
It seems hard to imagine now, with Marvel films regularly breaking box office records. But for years, they struggled to get their work adapted for the big screen. In fact, the first Marvel feature movie was actually Howard the Duck.
That's it. No more Mr. Nice Duck.
A box office bomb so bad, it was literally declared the worst film of 1986. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has come a long way since then, churning out hit after hit. But of course, it all started with the comics, which is where things took an interesting turn for Douglas Wolk.
On the last page, we see Doctor Strange hanging out in his study at home, and on his bookshelf is a copy of all of the Marvels. The book I wrote exists within the comic story. I could not be happier about this.
An unusual origin story, but proof that there's room for everybody inside the biggest story ever told.
More from the Marvel Universe coming up in just a few minutes. Up next, mind-bending puzzles and the man who wants to solve them all.
That goes there. So it is 8 sides, 144 minutes.
Exotic treasure maps, 4-hour corn maze marathons, unbreakable CIA codes. Our Martha Teichner tries to solve the mystery of why we love puzzles.
You are about to engage in Pancake Pictionary.
We're trying to communicate with our table using only pancakes.
Say what?
We have to communicate to them this name, Hermione Granger from Harry Potter, without words, without spelling, just pancakes.
It was January 2020, before COVID, that I met A.J. Jacobs.
The puzzles come in all shapes and sizes.
Overgrown kid and puzzle nerd doing research.
1, 2, 3.
Yes!
Yes, research for his new book.
Another fairy godmother.
Isn't that an arrow in her head? One more pancake and we got this.
This, believe it or not, is MIT, home of the MIT Mystery Hunt. The prize? A coin hidden somewhere on campus. But the prize isn't really the point.
This is the granddaddy of all puzzle hunts. It's been going on for 40 years, and there are 2,000 people, over 50 teams. So it's like Ironman triathlon for the brain.
Silly, you say?
All right, so AJ...
The storyline for the 2020 hunt involved goings-on at an imaginary fairy tale-themed amusement park. The solution to one puzzle was a clue to the next. Hundreds of different ones.
Rubbing his nose. This is part of the puzzle. You can't solve the puzzle without rubbing
his nose.
For more than 2 years, I tagged along with A.J. Jacobs on his puzzling adventures, even though I'm terrible at puzzles and games.
I've never played with a Rubik's Cube before in my whole life. I don't know what it means to solve it.
To solve means every side is just one color.
During the worst of COVID, we dropped in via Zoom
It's moving so fast it's sort of blurry.
on Daniel Rose Levine, a Rubik's Cube whiz, then 17, holder of several world's records.
So timer on.
You saw it.
How many seconds?
47 seconds.
Wow.
With his feet.
Okay, that goes there.
AJ being AJ, he had to try this Rubik's variation, the Star Minx.
That is messed up.
He never solved it.
Yep. And now it's broken.
Why are you so fascinated with puzzles?
Puzzles to me are all about curiosity. And curiosity to me is the most important human value we have. Without curiosity, we'd be nowhere.
A.J. Jacobs likes slotting himself into his subject matter. For one of his books, he read the entire Encyclopedia Britannica. For another, he followed the Bible to the letter.
Here I am in the great Vermont corn maze, 100% lost.
So, of course, he had to attempt, possibly, the hardest corn maze in the country.
Here is the bell of frustration. And I am frustrated.
It took him nearly 4.5 hours, but he made it out.
So you picked up quite a cheap chess set, huh?
Like a real-life Forrest Gump, amateur AJ sat down with chess grandmaster and former world champion Garry Kasparov, now an outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin.
I can offer him many that cannot be solved by any grandmaster.
I want to see some of those.
They're talking about chess problems, super difficult, counterintuitive scenarios.
Studies help you to understand the geometry of the board.
Right.
Sometimes, it's like Alice in the Wonderland. So yes, you move in one direction, but you end up in the other direction.
My book kind of covers how life imitates puzzles and problems.
It's basically the same as you learn from chess, because life is about making decisions.
Simple as that.
Yeah, exactly.
Simple. Ha!
These pegs, you have to turn not 100 times, not 1,000, not 1,000,000, 1.2 decillion times. That's 1 with 33 digits after it.
Look at this contraption, named after AJ, Jacob's Ladder.
Literally impossible to solve.
So why try?
Well, that's what I love about it. It represents the joy of trying. It's about the journey. And to me, it's a great metaphor for what puzzles should be.
That journey included a trip to see one of the most famous unsolved puzzles in the world.
It's been a long time.
A kind of puzzler's holy grail. Even getting a look at it is almost impossible because it's located at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia.
There it is.
It's called Kryptos and involves codes.
There is a solution that's kept sealed here.
Randy Burkett is one of the CIA's historians.
Part 1 starts at the top left on this side. This is the encrypted section. And it flows through 1 and 2. 3, it falls below the rivets there. And 4 is at the very bottom.
Since it was unveiled in 1990, 3 of its 4 sections have been solved.
I tried to memorize the first one. Between subtle shading and the absence of light lies the nuance of illusion.
He misspelled illusion on purpose with a Q for the second L.
Occlusion.
What are the chances that this is all, at the end, a huge joke?
That chance is there.
It's enough to drive you crazy.
This is the position of the bolts here.
The puzzles A.J. Jacobs loves. They're all really complicated. As he says, just like life.
It's like Mount Everest, but for the mind. You know, this is like millions of human hours of labor, all to crack this. And in some sense, that's absurd, but in some sense, I think it's inspiring.
After the break, more from the land of superheroes and supervillains. Stay with us. Welcome back. As promised, here's more from Luke Burbank's conversation with author Douglas Wolk.
You know, to people that don't read comics and are not that familiar with the comic side of the Marvel Universe, why do comics matter?
So one of the reasons that superhero comics, and in particular the Marvel story, matter is that they're everywhere in culture. There's the movies, there's the TV shows, you see them on t-shirts, you see them on bags of salad greens, you see them on belt buckles. Spider-Man and the X-Men and the Fantastic Four and the Hulk and Iron Man and the Avengers, they're a common language. They are a set of ideas and a set of stories that a lot of people know. There's not a lot of those, and they're really special when they turn up. The other thing that's interesting about them is that comics are a medium that are not like any other. They're made by very, very few people. They are made by a particular artist or a couple of artists who are interpreting the world through their eye and through their hand. What their style contributes to the way the story is told. What a single image or two images together or a bunch of images in sequence can do to make a story that happens on the page and happens in your head. Nothing else does that.
You obviously came across a lot of content that, as we would say, doesn't really hold up. I mean, how do you reconcile your love of this medium with the fact that there are a lot of things from a gender standpoint, from a race standpoint, that really would not be accepted today?
Oh, there's some super problematic comics. Always have been, and probably always will be. There's stuff that we're looking at now and thinking like, yes, this is good, this is fantastic, that 10 years or 15 years from now we're going to look at and think, what were they thinking? I think is really interesting because it makes you actually think about what matters, what's important, what is problematic, and why, what the problems are, how we feel about these things differently than people used to. I talk in the book about one of my favorite series from the 70s, Master of Kung Fu. And those are great comics, and they're crazily problematic comics. And they're also thoughtful and smart and beautifully drawn and really progressive in some ways. And it's all mixed up together, and you just have to go in there and deal with it. And one of the really fascinating things about Master of Kung Fu in particular is its letter columns. People wrote to Master of Kung Fu and they would say, I love this comic, I'm really into this character, there's some racial stuff in here that just does not look good. What is up with coloring Asian characters bright yellow or bright orange? Not okay, what's up with that?
So at the time, there were people who were noting that this was not appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely, and they would write letters. And these letters would be printed in the comic itself, and the creators and editors would respond to them, and it turned into a dialogue, and eventually they came to do better. Because of this dialogue that you can see playing out in the letter columns, in the pages of the comic itself, which is amazing.
Is it generally a progressive space?
Yeah, generally. Generally progressive space, not uniformly, but there's so much fascinating progressive stuff from the very beginning. superhero comics have been political from the get-go. The first issue of Captain America, he is punching out Hitler on the cover. That is a comic that was published in December of 1940, a year before the US entered World War II. Captain America was created by two Jewish men in New York as an argument for the US to enter World War II. You can't get more political than that.
What did you learn in those 500,000 pages?
I learned a lot about American history in particular, and how America feels about certain things and how that changes over time. If you look at 60 years of Iron Man stories, you are looking at 60 years of how America feels about the military-industrial complex, how America feels about the relationship between the army, the military, and manufacturing, heavy industry, because that is who Tony Stark, Iron Man, is. He is somebody who owns a manufacturing company that makes weaponry, that makes armature. And in the early 60s, it's great. It's rah-rah, let's fight the commies, we're doing our thing. A few years later, Vietnam is going on, and suddenly we're not really sure how we feel about this. A few years after that, there's drone technology starting to pop up in Iron Man stories. Iron Man is much less about suits of armor and big fancy weapons than it is about surveillance and intelligence and information. And the Iron Man story changes the same way, while still being about people in big metal suits having fights with each other.
I like the term you use for yourself in the book, that you're an accumulator.
Yeah.
More than a collector.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever spent more than $20 for a comic, and usually much less.
And yet, at this point, you're probably the only person on planet Earth who has read all of these.
I know of at least two others.
Really?
And there may be a few others, yeah.
Are you in some sort of superhero group with those other people who have actually spent the time to study all of this?
I mean, the ones I know about, like, we're in touch with each other. There's not like a 27,000 club or anything. You know, it's not a badge of pride. It's a badge of shame.
I mean, at least you got a book out of it.
I did get a book out of it. And I got to bond with my son over it, which was awesome. I don't recommend anybody else do what I did. I don't think you have to read everything to understand. I don't think nobody was ever supposed to read all of these comics. They're supposed to be there for fun and pleasure and entertainment. You pick up what you like, you read what you like, you don't read what you don't like. That's what they're there for. You don't have to be a completist. Don't be like me. Don't be like me.
I'm Tracy Smith. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you here next time on Here Comes the Sun.